The union of science, religion, spirituality. What does it do to humanity? Harmony and peace. Yes. Let's start with that. Science. I think all the rest of the things you guys are all already aware of. This is what we are going to do today. Science. And for that, let me introduce our keynote speaker, the science expert for this stage today, Karanbir Singh, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I wasn't quite expecting that. I hope you're all doing well. Mic further up. Can you hear me? Is audio good? Yes? No? Yes? Okay. Perfect. So I can't see that sign up there. But just based on what was being said, I think it's quite topically accurate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you guys a question. Can you actually see the bottom of the slide? Okay, perfect. Because there's going to be some fantastic stuff coming up over there, and I don't want you to miss it. So, does anybody in the room know this slide? Has anybody seen this image before? Okay, there's one person who has seen it. Two, okay, Brian knows it as well. So, it's a really interesting thing. This is the background for one single instance of one single operating system that ran 57% of the internet in 2012. I just want you to keep that at the back of your mind. Pretty much every property that you look at on the internet today, from Facebook to Instagram to YouTube to basically everything, right? Amazon as well, that existed in 2011 was probably running this. Just keep that at the back of your mind. So welcome. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for coming to hear me. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about open source, right? What does open actually mean? What does source actually mean? Where does it come from? Where does it go? 25 years ago, it would have meant only one thing. It would have meant software. Today, people use open source to mean all kinds of things. Like people write books in an open source kind of way. People go on journeys in an open source kind of way. People have friendships in an open source kind of way. But I can assure you that I am going to be talking about software. I'm going to be talking very much about code. I'm going to be very much talking about what open source means and where we are in the open source world today, right? My name is Karanbir Singh. I am an engineer. I work at Red Hat. But the most important thing is that I am old enough to remember when this is how people used to write Hello World applications. I don't know if I have many people in the audience here who are old enough to remember that, but essentially when you started doing an online or a web project, a website, the first thing that you did and spent ages working on was getting your under construction site up. So again, when you think through the perspectives of where I'm coming across, I want you to keep that in mind, right? To give you an idea on where I am and who I am, in 1996, I was second year college in Chandigarh, in Punjab. And there was some guy who had just come from Bangalore, from the IISc, who knew about something called Linux. And he had a book. And at the back of the book was a CD-ROM drive, which none of us had actually seen before. So we did a sort of almost like a GoFundMe. It just wasn't called a GoFundMe back in the day. And we bought a CD-ROM drive to get 65 floppy images off that CD-ROM drive, right? And I submitted my first kernel driver to the Linux kernel in 1997, which was the driver required to support the CD-ROM drive that we had to use to get Linux off the CD-ROM drive. From that time on, I worked on various other things as well. Thank you. It was, I can assure you, it was an effort of much pain. It took quite a bit of effort because you could use Windows, I think 95 at the time, to get the images off. But you couldn't install Linux because if you installed Linux, it would require the CD-ROM drive. But the drivers for that didn't exist in Linux at the time. But now you fast forward to a point where I can assume, and we'll do a test, right? Is there anybody here in the room who doesn't touch Linux on a day-to-day basis? Is there anybody who has a doubt whether they touch Linux on a day-to-day basis? I was going to make a joke, but I won't make it because I had a problem this morning, right? What I was going to say was that Linux is everywhere and it just works. And it did, we did get it working and I've got my screen up, right? But it did take a little bit of an effort. In my defense, this laptop that I'm using right now is an ARM-based device. That is actually a pre-production version. It isn't actually available to buy yet, and I'm still working on the power management for it. So I do have a reason why it didn't work, but it did work. And we're at a point now, coming from a background where, I remember an organization called ILUG. It was the Linux user group in India. And we used to meet every 3 months. And if we were lucky and we had huge attendance, 6 people would come. Right? If it wasn't going that well, it would be me and the guy whose house we were meeting in having a cup of tea. And we'd probably have to make our own cup of tea as well, right? The key thing to take away is the evolutionary arc, right? Where we've come from and where we are today. Linux is a part of our mainstream lives today. But Linux is a great example of what open source is, but it isn't the only example there is. And I'd like to dig into that a little bit, right? So we know that open source won. We know that open source is everywhere. We know that everybody's touching open source. We know that it's a part of our lives. We know that pretty much anything and everything you do with technology today has an open source element to it, right? But the question that is really hard to answer is, one, what exactly? Like, who got the medal for it? But nobody did. Nobody actually got a medal, right? Nobody actually won individually. But what happened from an ecosystem standpoint is that I know there are people here in the room who were born after the internet came up. A few days ago, I was involved in an interview with somebody who's hiring on as a senior principal engineer, who was born in 1999. After the internet had already been a thing, after like my domain had already been booked and I already had a website running on it, right? And the thing to think through is that there was a starting line. There was a very deterministic starting line. There was a world that was dominated by proprietary software. There was a world that was dominated by Unix. There was a world that was dominated by maybe 7 to 8 vendors. And your ability as a student, your ability as an individual to get access to best of breed was 100% limited by your bank balance or your dad's bank balance, right? If you wanted a database, you were going to have to write it yourself. Because at least in India, I know it, there is no way I was going to be able to afford $10,000 to buy a database. If I wanted to build a website, I wanted a web framework, guess who was writing it? I was, because there's nothing else there, right? You couldn't just npm install Node.js, or you couldn't just go React and go, right? Well, where are we today? We have won in a way that open source powers the inception of technology from the ground up. Whatever you want to do, wherever you want to go, how do you start? You start with enablement. Today, as a student in a university, if you want to get a database, you get access completely free of cost to not only the best in the business, but the best in the business that you can contribute to today. If you're interested in distribution systems, what is the framework that you can get? The best there is in the world. And so now when you think about it in terms of a 24-hour day, right? Most people have a couple of hours. You're super enthusiastic about something. You enjoy doing something. You have dinner. You sit down and do 3 hours, 4 hours, or whatever, right? What you are starting from is already an established base. So you're no longer building the base anymore. And what that does is that you're standing on the shoulders of giants in a way that every iteration, every piece of work that you do is a collaborative improvement on millions of other people's work. You will never meet them. You probably don't want to meet most of them anyway, right? And I think that is what winning really looks like. Who won? We did. The consumers of the open source piece, right? And where was the starting line? The starting line has gone so far back, we can't even see it anymore. Does anybody remember Borderland? There's one really old guy sitting in front here. You think about tooling enablement, right? Now, back in the day, does anybody remember Power Builder? Oh, there's a few more old people here. The starting line has gone so far behind that we can't even look back and remember where it was. Because the disruption has been so complete that it doesn't matter anymore. Open source has become a part of our lives. Open enablement has become a part of our life. And that's a super important thing to remember, because what is happening is, when you're passionate about something, you work on it, you think about it. When it becomes ubiquitous, you take it for granted. The moment you take it for granted, you set yourself up for the disruption that open source caused. Open source disrupted an ecosystem. It basically tore apart software development. And I'm going to go sideways. I wasn't going to talk about it, but I think it's interesting, right? If you really think about the fundamentals of where open source is coming from and what success looks like, as a developer, if you are a dentist and you can write software that dentists can use without actually having to invest in writing a bootloader first or getting a shim signed by Microsoft first, that is winning. That is open source winning. Because what you've done is you've enabled a subject domain expert to improve their own life in a meaningful manner, right? That is not what the software industry was back in the day. Let me give you an example. There's a small piece of software called Tally. I don't know if it still exists or not. But I was there when Tally 1.0 was released. Reverse engineering Tally would put you in jail. And I know people who got taken to court. It used to ship with a hardware lock to make sure that you couldn't make copies of it, right? Protecting IP was a way that people would build software. That's gone, right? And so when you talk about open source winning, open source has won. Open source has become a deterministic default in a way that is hard to articulate because innovation is accelerated because of open source. You know, when you look at the ecosystem today, you look around, there are very few things that you can do that don't involve technology. Very, very few things. You can't open the door to your car without technology. Many people, and I'm not one of them, you can't even open the door to your house without technology, right? And it's probably powered by open source. That's an important thing to keep in mind, right? So we won something. But what is open source? What is it actually, right? And there's I look at it as a 6-factor kind of a thing. That there is a licensing involved, right? There's an enablement function involved. And I was talking to somebody yesterday, just after lunch, and they made an assertion that, hey, you can just go do stuff because it's open, so it's free, I can download it, right? And I was like, it's not free, right? It's not free, that's not what it is. Open source is not free software. Open source is not free stuff that you just download off the internet, right? Open source is still encapsulated in a license. If you don't license your software, you don't have open source. You've just got random stuff that you wrote last night. Right? And it's important. So what does that licensing actually mean? Licensing for software gives you the ability to use it in interesting ways. It gives you open-ended entitlement to say, hey, yeah, sure, you can run a business on it, or sure, you can give it to your friend and whatever. And it comes with responsibilities. It's not, again, free. It's not that you can just download it, rebadge it, call it your own, and you're off, right? It comes with responsibilities. Those responsibilities have one very key element. They are there to not only protect the author of the software, but they are there to enable you, the consumer, to contribute back to the software. So when you downloaded software, and it is open source, the big win for you is that you are now being enabled to show up, right? And I think if you cannot enable that ecosystem, there is a question mark on whether you really have open source or not, right? There are some very big pieces of software out there today. There's a lot of stuff which is super popular. Big names, I won't go into the names, where they throw stuff over the fence, but they say, well, here's a free gift, don't bother sending me pull request. I don't think that is open source. I don't think that is very nice. I don't think that is the kind of thing that we want to kind of go after, right? So enablement in the licensing is super important. And if you don't see it, think twice about it, because what you have is not open source, right? The second aspect is experience. When you're building software and you're a person who's going to use that software, you want to build it in a way that you can use it easily, right? Compare that to the proprietary software industry where there's a product manager who goes and sits somewhere, tries to come up with the hallucination or comes up with a dream and says, yeah, we should use a green on the left side. I don't know if that matters or not, right? So one of the cornerstones of open source also is that when you're building software that you yourself use, the experience is delivered as a default. Because you're not writing software that somebody else is going to use and is going to pay you for it. You're writing software that you're going to use yourself potentially, right? And there's a caveat to it. As things get more complicated, things get diverse, things expand in size, things get complicated, it becomes rarer and rarer, right? So for example, at home, I might be working on a data center automation piece of software, right? Well, guess what? I don't have a data center. I would like to. If anybody has a couple of million hanging around and a nuclear power station they want to give me, I'd be happy to take that off your hands. But I don't have a data center. But the piece of software that I'm using, the piece of software that I'm building, the piece of software that I'm integrating into, the experience is mine. I'm actually pushing forward something that makes sense to me. So that's another part of it, right? The third part of it is maturity. And this is a misnomer. A lot of people think, oh yeah, open source is going to be good. Well, guess what? It probably isn't going to be very good. Because whoever wrote that software didn't write it for you. It's good enough for him and it's good enough on his laptop. Doesn't mean it's going to work for you. But here's the thing, because of the enablement that comes with the software, because of the fact that the experience is probably already complete, you can help with the maturity curve. So you can almost imagine that because you're enabled to, there's an expectation that the software doesn't have to be mature, doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be good enough, it has to be good enough for you today. And if it isn't, guess what? You can help. And helping, and Brian will talk to you about this like for days on end, right? Helping doesn't mean writing code. There's lots of ways to help a community, including participating in a community, right? And again, going back to the first part of it, enablement. If you're not enabled to participate, you don't have open source, you just have free stuff or public domain, if you will, right? So hopefully that makes sense. We're just moving forward. And there's a reason why the tree is going sideways, by the way. Don't worry about that. I'm an engineer, not a designer, which is why the color choice is also kind of reflected on it. So then this is the fourth part of it is trust, right? This is something that I feel super passionate about. When you think about software and you think about doing things with it, like you're going to put your own family photos on it, or the government is going to put your data on it to do taxation, right? Trust has to be implicit, right? You have to be able to trust the system. The very unique thing about open source is you don't actually have to trust the people behind it. You trust the system that you have. You trust the software that you have. If there are certain considerations that you have that, hey, I would trust it if it keeps 4 copies or something. I would trust it if it looks green. I would trust it if it does certain things. Guess what? You don't actually have to ask anybody. You should be able to build your own trust factor. You should be able to build your own trust domain. You should be able to go look at the software and get to a point where you can trust it. And guess what? If you don't trust it and you find something that is not trustable in it, guess what you can do? You're enabled to go fix it. If you can't fix it, you're enabled to go find somebody else to fix it for you. If you can't find somebody else to fix it for you, then you can be really, really nice and you can ask the developer to fix it for you. Let's forward that a little bit to where we are right now, right? So when you think about trust, everybody is scared about data. And I think there's some ProdSec people over here. I just want to congratulate you on making really good life choices when you were young to end up in an industry that basically has job security between now and the end of time, right? When the internet came up, it was a thing, boom, whatever, people started making choices. Enterprises, companies, data centers, everybody was trying to squeeze the lemon. Everybody wanted to make money. Everybody wanted to have a presence. It became important to have a website. Even if it didn't matter what was on the website, it became really important to have a info@mydomain.com, and then you would go around. Like I remember many years ago, again, this is going back to my childhood, right? I remember going to an event at the Delhi College of Engineering, and the coolest kids in town had visiting cards with the website domains on them. Which is why I came home, and the first thing I did was I booked a domain. So if you go look at the who's of my domain, you'll know what date I was in Delhi, right? During that process, a lot of people were making choices based on advice that they were being given by experts. A lot of those choices were really bad choices. And we have come to a point today where the safety, security, and the trust factor of data in systems is doubt. Like nobody can really confirm what it is. Because you might be fine, your ISP may not be. Your ISP may be fine, his upstream may not be. His upstream may not have updated his switches for 10 years and he won't tell anybody. So trust becomes a really important part of it. As open source becomes predominant, which it sort of has, and it kind of percolates through, the trust factor becomes important to a point where you can now go and tell somebody who uses open source that trust nobody except yourself. You don't have to trust a vendor because they say they're nice. You don't have to trust somebody else because he took you out for dinner. You trust nobody except for yourself, and you can assert your own trust. And that's a big part of open source, right? I think that kind of resonates, right? And the other part of it is it's still about code. Right? End of the day, what open source and what we are talking about today, right? For all of you guys who weren't here in the beginning of the session, we're talking about code. Open source means a lot of things. Why I talk about code is that at the heart of what this is, the heart of the community, why people came together, they came together to solve problems with code. That hasn't changed. People are still trying to make things happen, and how you make things happen is with code. There's open source training material, great. There's open source other stuff, which is fantastic. But we're talking about code, right? Specifically in that space. That hasn't changed. Code has evolved. And what that means is that if you're getting into systems and you're getting into software today, a really good way to start is by getting into open source because the code is available to you. The interesting piece over here is that this is still short of one part, right? So if you're enabled in a way that you can participate, and you're enabled in a way that you don't have to rebuild everything from scratch, there's a trust model that kind of works for you. There's a maturity curve that you find satisfactory. There is an experience that you think, okay, this could work for me. I could do something with it. What does that actually mean? And I want to dig into that a little bit, because what is actually happening right now is that when you start changing the message across these 5 things, you start losing something. And what you lose isn't the software, because it's on GitHub. what you lose is not enablement because it's still licensed as it was, right? But you start losing something, you start losing the piece that is the value of open source, right? And in so many ways, you're losing the ecosystem. You're losing the fact that other people can make your software better. You're losing the fact that other people can build other things based on your software, right? And it's a loaded word. Ecosystem means so many things. I think I did a bit of research. I spent like 3 minutes on it, trying to find out where did this word actually come from, because I use it a lot, and I know a bunch of people in here, we use it a lot, right? Where did it actually come from? And it actually comes from biology. Unfortunately, I wasn't paying attention in school when I was in the bio classes, but the formal definition, according to the dictionary, is that it is a community of interacting organisms, right? And their physical environment to exist in. Now, to exist in is a bit of a fatal thing, so I took that out. And organisms, I don't know what that is, so I said artifacts, right? Let's use that as a message, right? It's about artifacts, right? So what does that mean for us? Think of it in this, right? It's a little slice of the world where everything exists, but nothing actually matters on its own. Like if you had a world which had a whole bunch of whales and nothing else, that wouldn't be very nice. If you had a world which had a whole bunch of plants, let's say mango trees, right, but nobody to eat that would be a super waste, right? So an ecosystem exists in a way that you could divide it as a slice of the world in a meaningful manner, where components exist because of and in spite of each other. You know, in an ecosystem, you could always have hostility. That's a part of it, right? You could always have enablement. You could always have a communal kind of a factor to it as well, right? And so, how that actually maps back to ecosystems in open source is that some random people or a person is going to come up with a set of problems, right? You got a bunch of things. So what do? You look at what you have on your table. You look at what opportunities you have, and then you try and map that back to how am I going to solve this problem? And so you come up with a few ideas, some good, some bad, maybe brilliant, right? And then you go through an inception stage where you question what you're doing, why you're doing it. There's a GitHub repository with like a README file saying, first commit. And then 6 months later, you come back and say, I don't know what I was thinking about. But you go through the inception cycle where you try and figure out where you're trying to go, right? And I'm dumbing it down to a point where I'm talking about one repository, but the inception piece works even when you talk about huge scale, right? That you go through an initial cycle, you're trying to figure out like where you want to go, how do you want to go do it, what does the solution look like, how do you know you're done, how do you know you've got a good enough solution, right? So when you walk past that, let's assume you get some traction and there is somebody else in some part of the world who's just as crazy as you are. And they send you an issue saying, oh, hey, I think this is a great idea. Hey, we should do something about this. I can help you with this, right? And you're like, okay, fine. I've got a community. I've got something going on. So then you start driving adoption. If your experience is complete enough for yourself, then you start doing things when other people ask for it, right? And then you start building maturity because people will start telling you, I don't think that green works. You should try thinking of a yellowish green or whatever, right? So you start going through the maturity pieces. You start building out whatever happens, right? You still don't have an ecosystem. All you have is a science project. The point where you start getting sprawl, where people start building software using your software as a dependency, you've got sprawl. You've got traction, right? When people start going away and start doing layered innovation, for example, right? People start building net new concepts that didn't exist in the past, and you are a part of the solution, you've got an ecosystem. And how that ecosystem thrives is largely driven by layered innovation, where people take what you have and they create net new interesting solutions for things that you had no idea about and you don't care about, right? I don't know if anybody's seen that diagram where they just floated on the internet. It was on one of the XCD things where there is a base platform and then there's some bricks on top of it, and then some bricks on top of it, then there's a machine with steam coming out of it, and there's a nuclear reactor, and there is like all sorts of stuff going on. And at the bottom of it, there's a little toothpick that is holding the whole thing up. I'm sure you guys have seen that, right? So I have a great example for that. It's called curl. I'm guessing everybody's used curl in the room, right? So curl is one developer who works in his spare time because his day job is writing SSL layers at a company called Wolf Security. And he's supported curl individually, independently, himself for, I believe, 27 years now. So now you think about this stack and you think about the people. No, there's no people, there's a person there. And think about libcurl sprawl in the world. It is everywhere. I can take a bet with you that if there are 50 people in the room today, there are 60 devices that have curl running on it. So the ecosystem matters. What you build what allows you to build further matters, right? And I'm going to take an example, because again, going back to where we started from, right? Open source is at risk. People are trying to change what open source means. People want to co-opt what open source actually means. And a very ubiquitous part of our life is potentially going to change. And it's going to change in a lazy consensus because we don't know what we're going to lose. People have forgotten the ecosystems that open source has built, which is why it's hard to even visualize the loss value over here, right? I'm going to go through a couple of examples, hopefully that builds up, topically relevant for this audience as well, right? Who's heard of this little thing? Is there anybody in the room who doesn't know what Linux is? No, so that's good, right? This is going to be an easy slide. But the thing I want to point out to you is that it was started in 1991. Today, arbitrary distribution, random distribution, there are 68,981 packages available to you in one command. That's a Linux distribution. There are potentially 500 plus distributions. I'd probably say there are 15 that have mass market adoption, but there's a lot of distributions out there. There's a lot of people writing software. There's a lot of stuff going on over here, right? How much of money do you think those people get paid when one of their software gets used? 68,000 of them. That's the ecosystem. That is the ecosystem showing up for you. Right? Now you think about Linux. It was born in 1991. So how old is it now? Who's got math? Go on, somebody should do it. It's 2025 minus 1991. I see somebody reaching out for a calculator. 34. Right. No. That's a good way to think about it. If you can't get the number then, and if your birthday is around there, that's a problem. Okay. So now you think about that 68,900 packages, right? Okay, and then let's people will say that this is binary. Okay, admitted it's binary. But there are at least 15,000 source components that contribute into that 68,000 number there, right? Out of those, I would say less than 5% are corporate curated. Less than 5% of all of the content available to you in the Linux trees today comes from people who are being paid to do that exclusively. The rest of it is coming from people who are paid potentially to do something else, or who are not paid at all. They could be academics. They could be people in rocket science doing something over here, right? Things like curl, right? So you have an ecosystem. What happens when this ecosystem gets disrupted? Think of that. Android is a great example of a Linux ecosystem, right? If everybody packed up their bags and left, do you think Google could maintain 68,000? They wouldn't want to. Because most of the stuff like MySQL or Postgres doesn't run on Android. So what happens? The ecosystem fails. Who is hurt most when an ecosystem like this fails? It's not the corporate entities, it is the consumers. It is the people who are trying to get to layered innovation. There's another community we should talk about, right? Virtualization. Actually, before we go there, think about a world before Linux, right? Let's think back to 1999, to 2001, 2002, 2003, while Linux was going through its maturity curves. What Linux actually did was it split the hardware from the software from the workload. Today, we take it for granted, right? We take data and application as isolated from each other as granted. That is not the world that we're coming from. That is not the world that it existed in the past, right? The world in the past, people sold a single stack that included the hardware, the software, and the workload, and you had to buy it. There was no way to get away from it. There was no way to commoditize parts of it. That is the world that it came from, right? What Linux did was, it made the application developers completely independent, so you didn't have to be HP to be able to write software that would run on an HP system. You could be anybody. As long as you're using Linux, Linux would be your arbitrary platform under it, right? And so when you talk about layered innovation, you could almost say that Linux unlocked the potential for mass innovation in ecosystems like, I don't know, what's a good example? Ruby on Rails. I know it's completely adjunct, but Ruby on Rails changed the world. I don't know how many of you know this. But between 2004 and 2009, Ruby on Rails with this MVC platform approach basically changed the way software was written on the internet. The whole inception of what we think of as SaaS came from that ecosystem. And it was enabled because you did not need to be a complete solution provider. You could just be one part of it, right? And that's why the virtualization piece comes super important as well over here, right? That is the next paradigm, the next ecosystem that got built up. There are many hypervisors out there. Lots of people did a lot of stuff. But it was these two hypervisors, the Zen project, the Zen kernels, and the KVM enablement that basically unlocked this little thing that some of you may have heard of called the cloud. It changed the world. It changed the world. And it changed it in a way that the technology from inception, from a laptop to what you'd run in a data center, is the same stack. It enabled things like software as a service. It enabled data as a service. It enabled people to innovate even inside the workload in siloed environment, right? How many of you can articulate exactly what a world would look like if there was no cloud today? It's hard to imagine, right? Because of what it unlocked. And again, what is that? It's an ecosystem. It is an ecosystem curated by the virtualization stuff. Zen started it as a PhD project by two guys in Cambridge, in the UK. And for a long time, it remained an academic product or a project. So again, think of that, right? The entire cloud ecosystem curated out of open source, right? So the third example I want to go into is a small little thing called the containers. Now, the container wasn't the bootstrap for the ecosystem, Kubernetes was. But what did it actually do? For the first time, it brought together, in some level of antagonist fashion, if you will, right? People weren't all happy about it, but some people are happier than others or whatever, right? It brought together the four most important domains on running systems. Because applications are getting more complicated, there is more moving parts. And the way I kind of talk about it is that very few people today actually build applications from the ground up. Nobody really starts by saying, oh, hey, I need to build an accounting system, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write some hardware firmware. Right? Then I'm going to start writing a Linux kernel or a kernel, and then I'm going to build my own libc, and then, nobody does that, right? Nobody does that. You just go straight in, you install Node.js, and then, you're off. Or you install Llama or whatever on your machine, and, 3 hours later, you got an accounting system. Which may not actually work. I highly recommend you don't do that. Systems got complicated. Systems got complicated to a point where it was no longer really viable for providers of components to try and satisfy every use case that their software would get used in, right? And so containers become a really good way to do very lightweight packaging, and you ship what works, and what works for you will continue to work as long as the environment is maintained, right? Kubernetes became like a rock. It was complex, but not more than it needs to be. It was complete, but just barely enough, right? It enabled an ecosystem to come up. Now I'm going to, rather than talking you through this, because I'm guessing everybody here knows of the CNCF, right? This is what the situation was in 2018, 2019. This is the landscape V2. There's a blog up there that talks about this, right? There's not a lot of logos on there. There's a few, they're all kind of around as well. Do you know what this looks like today? This is only 1/3. I couldn't fit it in a meaningful manner, so I was like, this is 1/3 of what that ecosystem looks like today. So now again, coming back, right? If you lose the open ecosystem, what do you lose? You lose this. You lose the ability to innovate in a way that is meaningful. You lose a way to grow, building with each other. You're essentially resetting time in a way that everybody has to start reinventing the wheel again. And so ecosystems matter. Ecosystems are the heart of open source. The heart of enablement is communities and ecosystems. Keep that in mind. If that's one thing you take away from this session, right, keep that in mind. Because what is coming next is arguably AI fueled, right? I don't know if anybody has a drinking game, and if you take a shot of something every time somebody says AI, but you might want to uncap the bottle and get ready. Nobody found that funny. That's like I used to work for somebody back in 2008, 2009, where the boss would come to the meeting with a bottle of whiskey. And every time he heard a bad idea, he didn't have to say anything. Meeting stopped very quickly. The team got very productive very quickly. Anyway, because the last thing you wanted was a drunk boss, right, in the office. Okay, so I want to go through this a little bit, right? So when you talk about AI, there is like, if you think about cycles in computing, right? The cloud was a big wave. It changed how we think about stuff. It changed how we do tenancy. It changed how we do security. It changed how we build software. It changed how we run software, right? The internet was a similar approach, right? It changed how we build software. It changed what we build. It changed the outcomes that we're looking for. It changed perception. It changed enablement, right? AI is going to be that next wave. And this is where the risk factor comes in, because when you think about AI, everybody uses AI to mean different things. And it's super important that you split it into the domains that matter. AI as code is very different from the models that power it. It's very different from the data that goes into the models and how you use it. and is very different in a domain from the infrastructure that you use to run it on. Now, you could argue that all of this is required to build a story, but that doesn't mean that all four of them have to be spoken about in the same fashion, because they're different things, right? And an easy way to normalize that a little bit is to think of it through, if you had a square set of glasses and you had two eyes, that is what I was trying to get to. Maybe I didn't get there very well, right? But there are two aspects to it, right? Some people are going to have to go figure out a way to make AI work. Some people are going to have to figure out a way to make AI better, right? Not everybody. Because everybody else is going to have to figure out a way to make AI useful to you in existing applications. That doesn't mean being a physicist or being like a mathematician in the AI space. Two very different domains, and it's very important to think through those, right? Just moving forward a little bit. There are ecosystems that are showing up in the AI space. There are people coming together to rally around certain things, right? Like Kubernetes matured very quickly. The hyperscalers matured very quickly with the hypervisors that were on offer. That is not happening in the AI space because technical innovations over the last 10 to 15 years mean that a lot more people can posture for control. A lot more people can pretend that they're in control. And everybody wants to own the first mile, if you will, right? Because if you own the first mile, then everybody else is building their applications on your stack. You can do whatever you want. In spite of that, there are ecosystems showing up. Like I bring up the example of VLLM. It's a thing that I've been looking at recently. It came from an academic, and it actually continues to be an academic project with a lot of traction coming up. I don't know if anybody's heard of it, if you haven't heard about it, but the interesting thing is that if you think about the community coming up around it, it's a 1.5-year-old project. Lots of people are starting to use it. It is becoming the de facto standard for inference. So if you're today starting off a journey in that space, this is a great place to start from. It's not the only one, but it's a great place to start from, right? And why should you do it? Who else is doing it? Everybody. Everybody who's in this space is looking at VLM. VLLM is a very small part of the AI landscape. It speaks to the code part of it, not the other three, right? Now, when people talk about control, what is actually going on behind the scenes? What is the whole piece? People are scared that AI will allow their competitors to get better than they are at things that they take for granted, right? That fear is something that you will protect against. That is something that you will invest aggressively against, right? Who's the biggest threat in disrupting control? It's open source. Because when open source comes together, communities and ecosystems come together, the resulting output is far greater than the individuals that are a part of it, right? And you can move a mountain if you have enough people moving it. People are scared of that. So there's an element of control that comes in. There's an element of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? FUD, if you guys remember that from back in the day. People want to control what you can do with AI. People want to control what AI can do for you. People want to basically control the last mile execution, which today is enabled on and enabled by open source ecosystems. So what's happening here? They are trying to disrupt open source. They're trying to redefine what open source means to make it more convenient for them to take control. People are working aggressively against the idea that open source even needs to have source involved. Now let's go back to where we started from actually, right? The first thing I brought up on what open source means is enablement. Being enabled to make a difference, being enabled to improve, being able to make worse if you wanted to, right? In a world which doesn't include source, there is no such thing. You could argue that, well, you could do RAG or you can do, fine tuning or whatever, but the fundamentals boil down to the fact that what gets shipped out is not something where you are enabled at all. So think about that, right? What is also happening is that a lot of profit and control kind of comes in because open source already has so much and it has matured so much that a lot of people think of open source as free stuff they download off the internet, you make a business, don't tell anybody about it. Nobody will find out, right? Which is fine, except when you go out and look for job opportunities, when you guys go out and look for places to work, places to build businesses, etc., right? A cornerstone question should be to an employer, what is your open source policy? Because I can guarantee to you, well, I guarantee as in, it's unless you sort of work for defense or something like that, there are very few industries, there are very few companies, there are very few opportunities that exist today that are not touched by, that don't consume or don't directly influence open source. Everybody is building a software company, from the Ford Motor Company to the guys doing nuclear science, to all the AI guys, to the people building the railways. Everybody essentially is building a software company today, right? And every one of them is touched by open source. So your question to that audience should be, well, what is your open source policy? Are you a consumer? Are you a contributor? Do you allow people to contribute? What is the licensing mechanism around it? That is super critical because that is how you start the conversations on how to dilute the idea that one person or a small group of people could take control of an ecosystem. So just moving forward, right? Go back to how communities are built, how ecosystems are built. In the AI space specifically, we are right at the bottom here. We are at the problem people sort of stage. We haven't really gone up further. So the opportunity to get involved, the opportunity to influence where this whole ecosystem is going to go is now. It's not in a year from now, it's not in 2 years from now, it's not in 3 years from now. We have to basically think through what we are doing. We have to think about how we use AI. We have to think about the data that goes in. We have to think about how it's used, who ships it, who controls it, to what extent. There is an interesting aspect that kind of highlights this. Somebody released a model that refuses to answer questions of a political nature. Which is, you're saying, oh, that's okay, that's fine. So you're telling me, use this for math instead, right? But now when you talk to it for math, do you trust the answer it's giving you on math? You can't. You can't trust it for anything because you don't know what else it's trying to hide from you. Because it is smart enough to know what you're trying to get to and therefore head you off. How do you get past that? That's a moment for now. Things like AI safety, things like trustworthy AI, things like security and data provenance, the time to address that is now, and to bring it to a world that has a meaningful impact in the open source communities, that is now. Because I think, hopefully you guys will agree with me that this is where we're getting started. We're only getting started now, and it's important that we fix this now. Because what do we stand to lose? If open source dies, what do we stand to lose? The very foundations of what we are building our lives against. Think about 20 years from now. Can you think of a world that has no computers? Can you think of a world that doesn't have any computing device? Now think back to the fact that those devices, those interfaces are all built on and with open source today. And if it could be influenced by a very small set of people, what have we given up? We have given up control. We have lost the open ecosystem. My name is Karanbir. Thank you for listening to me. If you want, and I would really appreciate it, if you guys have an open source story, if you want to talk to me about it, my email address is on there. Drop me a line, and it'll be fantastic to get in touch. I'm happy to spend as much time. I'm happy to talk to anybody wherever I am. And the last thing I'm going to say to you before I kind of go quiet is that I have these stickers with me. So if you believe in open source, come find me during the course of the day today and collect your sticker. Doesn't have to be a sticker. It's just a token. It's just a token that says that you believe in open source and you're going to support it, right? So come find me through the day. I'm going to try and spend as much time as I can walking around. And I look forward to talking to you guys. I hope this was interesting and meaningful to you. Okay, we have like 46 seconds if anybody has a question, really quickly.
Of open source that's changing, right? There are these symbiotic forces and then there's this parasitic forces. Both parties being a part of open source, some giving into the upstream while some just taking. What impact do you think does it cause to the entire ecosystem from both of these parties?
That's a great question. I think so. There is a consumer community for sure, right? People who just use the software, they don't actually contribute back anything at all. And I think that's actually fine because in so many ways, an ecosystem is only as valuable as the people who can use it for some intent. You know what I mean? Like if you have a developer community that is just creating a tool that nobody else is ever going to use, that may not be worth it, right? But if people are using it and if they do run into issues, as long as they're within the licensing terms, that community can still thrive. So I don't see that as a harmful kind of thing, right? What I do see as a challenge is if you have people who are downstream productizing or people who are working outside of the licensing requirements for the open source. That is harmful, that is hurtful, that can cause a lot of issues, right? You can also have situations. I wasn't expecting that. Am I okay to go forward a few minutes? So you can also have situations where certain people, under pressure will start giving up control of projects. Purely because they don't have the wherewithal to support a consumer ecosystem. And so you got to watch out for that. Hopefully that answers your question. Otherwise you can find me and we can chat about it.
Any more questions? Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, actually, I liked your seminar. I just have one question: that what were the security challenges that you faced when you joined into open source, and how did you overcome that?
Security challenges as a contributor?
Yeah, as a contributor or as a community.
I think security is a very interesting topic because there's no deterministic yard scale, right? You're never really done. You know what I mean? So you start from a point where you feel that you're secure enough, and then you work forward as other people kind of find issues in your states. And you should always assume that you're not done. You should always assume that there are issues with it, right? Going back to when I started, which is I think what your question was. When I started, it didn't matter. You just wrote random code. You sent it to somebody over an email list, and either you got really good feedback or you found Linus on the other end, who would not hold back, and he would give you advice, right? But it was very much a community-driven thing. Over the last 30 years, that posture has changed quite a lot. People actually care about security first. People actually care about what you're doing. I think the methodologies have evolved to quite an extent as well, right? I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember CGI bin with Perl. That was not a secure system. Cool. Anybody else, or I can then go? How about I come find you? I'll come find you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Since we're short on time, thank you so much. Can everybody please come to the stage? We can click a small photo.
Small photo.